Bienvenidos a una emisión más de Pensadores Contemporáneos. En esta ocasión vamos a conversar con la doctora Deborah Gordon de la Universidad de Stanford. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. It's great to be
Deborah.
here.
And I would like to ask you about the ecosystem in your home that impulse science for your life.
Well, in my childhood, I didn't really encounter much science. My parents were interested in literature and the arts, but for me, science was something that was practiced by other people and actually not something that girls did, I think. And I didn't really discover science until I was in college as an undergraduate. So I think, though, that part of what I got from my home was that because my father was a politician and he was a progressive Democrat in the Florida state legislature at a time when there weren't very many other people like that. And he was interested in pursuing the truth in a different way and in thinking about how to make things better for people. And though well, what I really want to say is that being a politician means that you care a lot about how things look. And I think for me, science was a way to pursue the truth where there were clear rules for what's true. And that was very comforting to me, to discover a way of working and learning about the world where everybody agrees how we have to do it to establish what's true.
And
that make sense?
yes, and that means also that you met some people that were also trying to discover truth and to try to do something that is good for the collective consciousness. In that way, you met Elie Wiesel since you were a child.
Yes, we were just talking about that. I met Elie Wiesel when he came to speak, and I don't really remember what the circumstances were because I was a child, but I was very impressed by the sadness that he carried with him. So his work was to help people think about the Holocaust and to try to think about it in a way that would ensure that it could never happen again. And to do that, he wanted to keep reminding people of what had really happened. And I was very impressed with the way that he kept his focus on remembering what happened.
On memory and truth.
And truth, yes.
And in a different way, you pursued truth within science. And let's talk about how that research began, because at the beginning was embryos. Yeah.
That's right. Well, actually, at the very beginning was a course in comparative anatomy. So when I was an undergraduate, I first thought that I might want to be a doctor. So in the US, the system is that as an undergraduate, you pursue a degree in biology, and then later you go to medical school for another 5 years. And I took some classes in biology, and I really didn't understand very well what people were talking about. But then I took a class in comparative anatomy where we dissected animals looking at the evolutionary pathway from sharks across vertebrates up to primates. And it was amazing to me to be able to see and touch a body and to see how intricate all of the muscles and nerves and bones are. And when I graduated from college and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, I went to take a class in human anatomy at a medical school because I thought that, because my mother was ill, and I thought that if I could see how my body is made, I would somehow be able to have control over my own health. And of course, that turned out not to be true because when you take anatomy, the body is dead. So you can see what you're made of, but you don't see how it works when it's alive. But once I had done that, then I was part of the way towards a master's degree in biology, so I finished that. And then really I went to graduate school not really understanding what it was that I wanted to do. really, I went to graduate school in ecology and animal behavior because I wanted to be outside. And I thought that that would be a life where I wouldn't have to wear uncomfortable shoes and I could be outside. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that. But when I got to graduate school, I had an advisor who had been in developmental biology named John Gregg. And he gave me a lot of reading about 19th century developmental biology and the transition in developmental biology from thinking about an embryo as a collective group of cells to the more reductionist ideas of the middle of the 20th century, which were based on the hope that you would just find a gene for everything and that would explain everything. So what John Gregg introduced me to was understanding that really an embryo develops through interactions among the cells. And there's nobody in the embryo that tells everybody what to do. There's nothing that says, okay, you go be liver, you go be bone. And yet through the cells interacting emerges an embryo that's a functioning organism. And I started to think about working in developmental biology, but at that time especially, and this is still true, that to see how an embryo develops, you have to kill it and slice it up, and then get another one that's a little older and kill it and slice it up. So you can't really watch it happen as it happens. So I chose to work on ants for a very indirect reason, to understand how collective behavior works in a system where you can see everything, because it's very important to me to be able to see.
Yeah, and there was the paradigm of reductionism, and you got into the paradigm of complexity sciences.
Yes.
How it was that change for you? Because there was more of, there was opposition in the thinking of academy,
Yes.
Especially in the times you were beginning to do your research.
Yes. Well, I think it helped me to come in from the outside. So because my background, my undergraduate degree was in French literature, I had a background in the humanities, and so when I came into science, it was a little bit as an outsider. And I felt uncomfortable with the explanations that I was reading.
With the reductionism?
Yes, I never felt comfortable with the reductionist explanation. It doesn't seem to me, looking at the world, that we can understand what's happening by taking everything apart and then trying to put it back together. But that instead we need to understand what's happening as a process that involves engagement between the system that we're looking at and the whole system around it.
And how then you began to do your research on ants? You went to do experiments in field. How it happened, the whole process?
Yes, actually, first I started thinking that I would work on honeybees, so I went out to watch honeybees, and two things happened. One is I got stung a lot. And the other is that you can't see. I mean, they fly away, and then you can't see them. So I started working on ants by going out and doing what anybody would do, standing there and looking at ants. So I actually started first looking at harvester ants, which I'm still working on now, because a professor suggested those because he had read a paper that he thought was interesting about those ants. And in fact, my first attempt was to duplicate that paper, and I couldn't. I got very different results, and that sort of also helped to lead me on a different path, because I found when I started doing my work that the results I was getting did not match up with those that I had read about that were reported in the literature. So there was at that time also a reductionist notion of how an ant colony works, and the idea then was that each ant has its job and it is genetically programmed to do its job, and it just does it. But what we see is that an ant does different tasks in different situations, and that in fact it isn't, well, really that you can't explain what an ant does just by looking at the ant by itself, but you have to understand how the ant is acting in relation to the other ants.
Oh, that's very interesting. And how did you do the painstakingly job of trying to identify each ant for the purpose of seeing their paths?
Well, one thing that we do is to mark ants with paint. So you can take an ant and you have to make it a little cold because ants, like most insects, can't move when they're cold. So it's all curled up, and most important, its antennae are flat, so then you have a moment to take a pin and dab it in some paint and put it on the ant's head, and so then you've got a mark of paint on the ant.
And then you begin to see the paths they follow by computer, yes?
Well,
Well,
when I started out, I didn't do that, but yes, we can videotape the ants, and then we can use image analysis to track them. In fact, you don't need to mark them to do that, but if you mark them, it helps.
It's easier
Yes.
to identify what they are doing. And what amazed you when you began to see the paths they followed?
Many things amaze me. So what I learned over time was that ants are just using the rate at which they meet to decide what to do. So they're not giving each other any complicated messages. And so what really amazes me is that the basic interactions are so simple, and the system is so noisy, so random, and yet in the aggregate with enough ants, it works beautifully. So the most interesting thing to me is how a system that is so messy can work so well.
And intelligent anarchy
Well, nobody is intelligent, but the system
is intelligent. And that's very interesting because, you know, this maybe it's not right to say, but there is a comparison to say to some person that you have an ant brain when you're trying to say that there is no intelligence at all. But you see collective intelligence, and that's extraordinary.
Well, an ant brain is pretty impressive. They can distinguish now, looks like about 400 different odors. But an ant doesn't understand what needs to be done. It doesn't know how much food there is out there. It doesn't know how hot it is. It only knows how to respond to its interactions with other ants. And even that is in a very probabilistic way. And yet, when you put it all together, the colony functions very well.
And the algorithms that they take, for example, to get food, are very intelligent algorithms that are akin to the internet.
Well, the harvester ants that I study use a system of simple feedback, and many species of ants do this, and in fact, many natural systems also use simple feedback like the brain or cells in the body. So the way that it works in harvester ants is that a forager doesn't leave the nest until it meets enough foragers returning with food. So the more food there is out there, the more quickly they find it, the more they come back, and more ants go out. So it's a kind of a positive feedback. And the same system is used to regulate traffic in the internet. So there, especially in the early days of the internet, it wasn't worth it to send out any data unless it was sure, unless the system could be sure that there was the bandwidth to carry that data. So the way that the internet works, or TCP, this protocol for managing bandwidth, is that when you press the button to send a message, the data go out in packets. It doesn't all go out at once. And each packet doesn't leave the source computer until it's gotten an acknowledgement from the router that the last packet had the bandwidth to go on. And so in that way, the system regulates sending out data so that data doesn't go out unless there's enough bandwidth. In the same way that the ant colony regulates foraging so that the foragers don't go out unless there's enough food to make it worthwhile.
So in this way, you make an analogy to what the ants invented the internet.
Ants invented the internet, yes, possibly way before we ever invented it.
Millions of years before.
Yes, yes.
And nowadays you're studying something that could be said to be akin to the garden of forking paths.
Yes.
In ants in Jalisco.
That's right.
So let's talk about it, because this must be very interesting,
Yes.
because it has to do also with your new research and the new results you're getting.
Yes, well, it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to work at this beautiful research station of UNAM at Chamela. And there I'm working on turtle ants that live in the trees, so they never come down from the trees. And so an ant can only walk where there is a little stem or branch for it to walk on. And the canopy of the tropical forest is very tangled, so they're working in this very tangled network of vegetation. And a colony has many different nests that they must keep connected by the ants moving around and around in a highway or a circuit that connects one nest to another, because that's how they distribute food and keep the colony together. And they also make temporary trails off of that for food sources. So we've been trying to understand, how do they do that? Again, no ant has a map of this tangle of vegetation or knows where the food is or understands anything. The ants put down a pheromone on the branch that they're walking on everywhere they walk. So it's not like other ants that only put down pheromone when they find food. They lay pheromone all the time. So every time an ant comes to a little junction in the vegetation, it goes in the direction where most ants before it have put down pheromone. And the pheromone decays. So the ant won't smell anything if another ant hasn't been there recently. So the rate at which they go through determines how the path is formed. And I've been trying to understand how that changes over time. It's a very unstable environment. A lizard can go through and break the branch that they're using. The wind sometimes breaks off branches. And so I've been trying to understand how they repair those trails and how they maintain them. And working with some colleagues at University of California at San Diego, Saket Navlaka and his graduate student Arjun Chandrasekhar, we've derived the algorithm that they're using, and it's very simple. So, and all we need is to know the rate at which the pheromone decays, and one other parameter, which is how often an ant does the wrong thing or leaves the trail to explore. Because if they always go on the trail, they'll never find anything, and somehow they have to search. So really, this algorithm combines what in computer science is called a search algorithm. That is, when you tell Facebook that you want to send a photo to your friend over there, then the system has to search from wherever you are to wherever your friend is. So that is how computer science has developed a lot of search algorithms for use in large networks like the internet. And it also uses what computer scientists call a routing algorithm. That is, if you have some fixed points like cell phone towers, and you have a lot of people walking around with their cell phones, you want to know how and where to put your cell phone towers so that nobody will lose their connection. So those are routing algorithms for figuring out how to keep a bunch of different points connected. So the ants are using both a search algorithm and a routing algorithm. And the thing is that it's so simple. So all you need is the probability that an ant will leave the trail and the rate of decay of the pheromone, and that's enough to get this very complex system that the ants are using.
What other directions are you trying to explore regarding ants' behavior and collective behavior?
I think that there are very interesting analogies between ant behavior and collective behavior in other systems. So, for example, the way that ants move around in the network of vegetation is very analogous to the way that a signal moves around in the tangle of neurons in a brain. So a brain is, in a way, like the canopy of the tropical forest. There are many different connections. It's usually, fortunately, not as unstable. That is, the neurons stay put a lot longer than the branches in the tropical forest. But still, signal in the brain has to travel around in circuits for the brain to function. And those do change, for example, in learning and memory. So that area of neuroscience is called neuroplasticity, and I think there are interesting analogies between neuroplasticity in brains and the way that ants regulate their networks in vegetation. But more generally, ants are an amazing opportunity to see how different kinds of collective behavior have evolved in different environments. So there are more than 14,000 species of ants. They live in every conceivable habitat. and they have evolved different ways of working collectively that correspond to the way that their environments change. And we could see, I think, those same correspondences looking at collective behavior in other systems, that we will see some kinds of collective behavior are working in very unstable environments where you have to respond quickly and you have to be able to change very quickly, and other kinds of collective behavior in very stable environments where things don't change very fast.
So you see also some recurrent patterns.
Yes.
And that's very interesting because you love literature.
Yes.
And you know that recurrent patterns means unity of style.
Yes.
So what makes you feel when you see these recurrent patterns in different systems that brings you a sense of a great novel of nature?
Well, of course, we impose patterns, so that is what humans are really good at, is seeing patterns. I guess that there's really only a finite number of ways to do things, and so it's maybe not surprising that the same kinds of responses can evolve differently in different places. So we're familiar with convergent evolution in form. For example, we know that crabs have eyes and we have eyes, and both of them work to see, but they came about through very different trajectories. So it's familiar to us in looking at the world that you will see the same patterns popping up in different places in nature. So
same algorithms.
Yes, so that seems to be characteristic of the way that life has evolved.
Yeah, that must be very amazing to see.
Yeah.
And when you do this research, you prefer to do the lab work or the computer work, or to be in the field?
Oh, I love to be in the field. As people always say to me, how do you have the patience to stand out there for hours and count which ants are going through which little junction in the vegetation? But I love it. There are so many surprises, you know. Every day something happens that you didn't expect. So watching...
For example?
Well, the harvester ants that I study in Arizona, when there's going to be a storm, they get twigs and they make a little collar around the entrance to their nest, and they cover it with dirt, and so it makes a kind of a wall that prevents flooding. And it's just amazing to watch ants bringing in the twigs and weaving them in together when I know that no ant knows what can possibly happen. And yet it functions to protect the nest from flooding. Or in Chimela, in the tropical forest, it's a tropical dry forest, I see insects walk by sometimes that I feel like I'm in a Disney movie. I mean, one time I was there and this beetle came by. It was pink with big orange spots, and I mean, it looks like it can't possibly be real, but the colors of the insects and the birds and these enormous lizards and just the life that's there is amazing. So not just the ants, but everything else that's there.
Everything else. And when you study ants, it gives you also a feeling of what to try to understand in terms of the human anthill. I know that when we are saying human anthill, yeah, you have to have a perspective from very far away, yes, to see that. But what can we learn from ants in our collective behavior? Because it seems that they follow simple rules and they get organized and they get auto-regulated in a very intelligent way. And although we do the same kind of things, there are disruptions in this, yes, collective intelligence. So yes, how do you explain them?
One
yes,
obvious correspondence is that ants do things without a leader. So we tend to imagine always that everything that happens is initiated by some central director or manager or something that knows what's going to happen. And we even attribute that, for example, to genes and DNA. So we imagine that genes inside bodies are telling everybody what to do. But they aren't, and ants give us a way to see that larger that there isn't anything in the ant colony telling anybody what to do. And I think in many human systems, we look to see how some single person is making everything happen, and in fact, often that isn't really happening. So that's one lesson from the ants. The other deeper lesson has to do with how simple patterns of interaction can have larger outcomes in a very large network. So this doesn't apply to relations so much, say, within a family, but when you think about large social networks, the flow of information through the internet, where just the rate, the frequency, the pattern of interactions has an effect even without paying any attention to the content. So ants just use the rate at which they meet, and they don't care what the other one is saying. The other one is only giving information about how it smells. And I think that we can see in trends in information in the internet that sometimes just the rate of repetition matters rather than what's actually being said. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing some consequences of this in politics, where people are responding just to the repetition of information that isn't even true. And what's happening is that the repetition, or who you think the contact comes from, makes more difference than the content.
You know, Yuval Harari, that the historian,
Yes.
he was saying that this brings us nearer to what he calls digital fascism.
Yes.
And in the way that many companies know more about the algorithms of our desires
Yes.
that we know about ourselves.
Yes.
And how can we counteract this kind of behavior, learning about the systems and the collective intelligence that you study?
Well, before we can counteract it, we have to understand it.
Yes.
And we can see in nature different ways that systems like this work and see how they have evolved. And I think it's, in a way, encouraging to see so much diversity in the way that simple patterns of interaction play out in nature. So there isn't only one way to do it. So although in our social networks and the algorithms that you're talking about for collecting data from products that people buy, that's really
politics. And politics.
And politics,
we buy politics.
Yes, so the marketing of ideas, the marketing of votes, the marketing of products, which are all based on very similar kinds of algorithms for associating preferences in one category to preferences in another. And that's one way of managing a social network, but we see in nature much more diversity of ways of working with patterns of interaction. And so the first lesson is that it doesn't always have to be that way, because there are many other ways that things could work.
But we have to have more consciousness of our own processes, of how we process information.
Yes, we need to understand the patterns that we're using, and I think looking at the patterns that we see in nature, even if they're not the same, gives us some perspective on what we're doing and how it could be different.
Another area that is very interesting that ant behavior can illuminate is it has to do with understanding immunology, the processes of immunology.
Yes.
Let's talk about it.
Well, it's known in ant colonies that ants will often respond differently to an ant from another nest, an ant from another colony. And we know that that's related to the smell of the ant. And the simple idea is that every ant has a passport, you know, that says, okay, I'm the ant from this colony and you're the ant from that colony, and I don't like you because you come from the different colony. But the experimental work really doesn't support that. And working, in fact, with a Mexican colleague, Fernando Esponda, we have come up with a model that fits the data much better, and it treats the process like the same process that we know exists in the immune system. So we see an analogy between the way that an ant colony works and the immune system. And the idea is this, that each ant has a recognition boundary at any time where everything that smells on one side it thinks is the same nest, and it doesn't react, and everything on the other side it feels is a foreigner and it reacts. And over time, it changes that boundary. So when the ant is young and it works inside the nest, it only meets its nest mates, and the default is to accept. And it isn't until later when it goes outside and it starts meeting ants of other colonies, and maybe an ant of another colony acts aggressively towards it, that it shifts its boundary and it becomes less prone to accept everybody. So in an ant colony at any time, you have some ants that will accept everybody and some ants that will react. And that's consistent with the observations that if you take ants from one colony and ants from another colony, you put them together, sometimes they fight, sometimes they don't fight. They don't always fight. And we think that the reason is that when you take ants at random, you're taking a sample, and some of them are younger ones or ones that still are accepting everybody, and others have moved towards recognizing ants of another colony as foreigners. So any particular encounter is a sample. Just as in people of different countries, for example, it's not the case that everybody from one country hates everybody from another country, despite what our president likes to suggest. Instead, actual people are very different in how they react to each other. And this is how the immune system works also. So you don't have any cell in your body that recognizes every pathogen. Instead, over time, cell by cell, in encountering a pathogen, a certain cell in your immune system becomes able to recognize a certain pathogen. That's why vaccines work, because by giving a vaccine, you change some cells to recognize that pathogen so that if you get that disease again, you will react, the immune system will react. So the immune system also is a collection of different kinds of cells that have different boundaries in what they recognize as bad. And the default in the immune system also is to accept. If not, your cells would be at war with each other all the time. So there's this basic analogy between the way that the immune system works and the way that an ant colony works in recognizing who is of a different colony.
And this also will help us to understand how can we fight cancer, for example, in the future.
There are lots of interesting interactions in cancer and the immune system, and maybe we can learn to understand more about how cancer cells interact with healthy cells. But I think more generally, what we can learn from studying collective behavior in other systems about cancer is that cancer also is very diverse. So cancer is not one thing. There are hundreds of different kinds of cancer, and each of those reflects relationships between cancer cells and other cells in different tissues that behave very differently. There are some kinds of cancer that act very quickly. There's some kinds of cancer that are kind of specialized, that can only survive in a particular part of the body. So what we see in cancer is a huge diversity of different algorithms, if you like, for how interactions regulate behavior. And I think that seeing how collective behavior in different environments has different ways of proceeding could help us understand the different kinds of collective behavior of cancer.
And finally, what other examples of collective behavior and complex sciences strikes you nowadays? You have been studying ants, but what other behavior, collective behavior, it really amazes you?
Well, we're in a moment in cell biology where the imaging, the ability to see cells move around, has suddenly improved dramatically. And so now cells are looking like ants to many people because you can actually watch cells, you can watch a wound heal, you can watch developmental changes, cells coming together and moving around. And so I think that the world of cell biology is going to become like the world of ant ecology because finally you can actually see it.
And when you are asked about your work, what is the most frequent question you've been asked that is very pragmatic?
What to do about the ants in the kitchen. Yeah.
Tell us about it. What do you recommend?
I live in California, and there's an invasive species that comes into houses, and What I recommend for them is just to know that when the conditions get better outside, they will leave again. Because people use a lot of pesticide that is completely ineffective. And so in the area around San Francisco Bay where I live, I say that putting out pesticide is so useless, you might as well just take it and pour it directly in the bay, because it goes in the water and it goes in the bay and it doesn't do anything to the ants. So most of the pesticides that we use are much more poisonous to us than to the ants.
Oh, that's very important to see. And when you're talking about ants, there are so many myths about ants.
Yes.
But you want to see ants as they are, and you also find a love to the species, to the diversity of species, to the diversity of species of ants. Yes. Tell us about, please talk us about this attention, this fine attention that you're paying to ants that destroy the myths that we have about these species of nature.
Well, the main myth is that the queen tells everybody what to do, because it's very difficult for people to imagine a system with no one in charge. So most people imagine that some mysterious power is directing the behavior of the ants, and so that's the main myth. I have to say there are some ants that I don't like very much, but there are some ants that I like a lot, so they're different.
Yes.
And I prefer ants that are large enough that you can see them as a little animal doing something. So when they're really tiny, you know, I appreciate that it's fine for them to be tiny, but I don't really like watching them so much. Yeah.
And the difference about seeing them when you're in the field and seeing them in computer, how does that changes?
Well, when you look at ants in a video, like now when you're watching us on TV, you only see whatever you decide to put in the frame. So everything else that's happening, you don't see. So what's really interesting about watching ants in the field is that unexpected events that are not right within the frame of vision turn out to be important. And so every time you put a camera on the ants, you are restricting what you see.
So that's why it's so important, the paradigm of the complexity sciences that allows you to see the big picture.
Yes, well, everything that's alive is embedded in something else that's embedded in something else, and so you can
like
never...
Russian dolls.
Yes, so you can never really understand what you're looking at unless you look at what's outside it.
Deborah Gordon, really thank you very much for this beautiful interview.
It's a pleasure.
Muchas gracias. Finalizamos así una emisión más de Pensadores Contemporáneos en la UNAM con la doctora Deborah Gordon.